Welcome. Today we're looking at a case that is just incredibly tragic and complex. It's the 1994 contract killing of Farah Fratta in Texas.
It really is. And the sources we have here detail a criminal case that stretches over nearly 3 decades.
Right. It covers everything from, the initial marriage problems and a really bitter custody battle, all the way through the planning of the murder, the trials, appeals.
And ultimately the final conclusion for the man who orchestrated it all.
It's a remarkable legal saga, but it's also deeply disturbing. I think our goal today is to really synthesize this documentation we have in front of us.
Yes, and to do that, we need to analyze the timeline, really unpack the motivations of her estranged husband, Robert Fratta, and trace the legal journey for him and the 2 men he hired.
Joseph Pristash and Howard Gigri.
That's right. But before we get into the details, we have to acknowledge the immense tragedy at the heart of all this. Our deepest sympathies go out to Farah Fratta and her family, the Beckers.
Absolutely. The loss they suffered and then to endure decades of legal battles. It's unimaginable. So let's start with Farah. The victim was Farah Fratta, born Farah Famida Becker in Guildford, Surrey, England on August 5, 1961.
She married Robert Allen Fratta back in 1983. At the time, he was a public safety officer in Missouri City, Texas.
A police officer.
Oh.
And they had 3 children together, 2 sons and a daughter. So on the surface, you have this very stable, public-facing life.
A stark contrast, really, to the darkness that was about to unfold. That contrast is, I think, essential to understanding the story.
It seems like this murder wasn't a spontaneous act. The documents make it clear it was the end result of years of escalating hostility.
Exactly. This was not a crime of passion. It was a culmination.
So let's go back to the beginning of the conflict. Farah filed for divorce in March 1992. That's 2 full years before she was killed.
And this wasn't just a simple separation. The documents show the main legal fight was over the custody of their 3 young children.
And that custody dispute seems to be the central pressure point here. The divorce filing itself had some very serious allegations against Robert Fratta.
Yes, concerning his controlling behavior and just deeply inappropriate conduct. This created a really volatile atmosphere that just hung over them for 2 years while the case was pending.
So it's this bitterness over losing control, and then you add in the financial aspect of child support and alimony.
That combination became the clear catalyst for the murder plot.
And this desire for absolute control, both financially and over the children, seems to be what was driving everything Fratta did.
It does. And the sources are filled with testimony from his own coworkers, his friends, detailing these explicit, escalating threats he was making against Farah.
This wasn't just him venting his frustration, was it? This was a declared intent to, eliminate her as an obstacle.
It absolutely was. It established a clear motive rooted in his own self-interest. Multiple witnesses came forward.
What did they say?
They testified that Fratta frequently said he was going to kill his wife. And crucially, his motivation was always tied to the same things: his anger over potential child support payments and his desire to get sole custody of the children.
So he saw murder as a calculated solution to his legal and financial problems.
It's hard to believe, but yes. It's unusual to have so much specific testimony about intent, especially from a police officer's own circle.
And that's what makes it so powerful. The sources showed just how detailed his planning was. One of his gym friends claimed Fratta didn't just make general threats.
No, he discussed a very specific plan: using a gun, shooting her multiple times.
Another witness said he talked about making her death look like a carjacking gone wrong. He even brought a gun to a nightclub while he was talking about this.
This was way beyond just venting. It was active, premeditated planning.
The level of detail in these threats is just chilling, especially when you see what happened next. He wasn't just talking, he was actively looking for the tools to do it.
Exactly. The documents detail this active search process in 1994. Fratta, who was 37 at the time, was looking for someone to commit the murder for him.
And the testimony about that search is just as disturbing. He apparently told a female friend he was looking for hitmen, specifically of African-American descent.
Yes, the idea was probably to create layers of separation and maybe push a false narrative of a random crime. He approached several people,
including a friend at a diner, asking for help finding the right person.
And he eventually landed on his gym friend, a 38-year-old named Joseph Andrew Pristash, to be the middleman.
So Pristash was the go-between.
Right, and Pristash, in turn, recruited his own neighbor, an 18-year-old named Howard Paul Gidry, to be the actual gunman.
So the whole conspiracy, the hierarchy was perfectly clear. Fratta as the mastermind, Pristash as the middleman, and Guidry as the triggerman.
And the payment structure that came out in court confirms it. It underscores just how little he valued his wife's life.
What were the amounts?
Guidry, the shooter, was promised just $1,000. Pristash, for coordinating it, was promised $2,000 and a Jeep.
And that transaction provided the concrete proof of solicitation that prosecutors needed for the capital murder charge against Fratta.
It did. With the conspiracy in place, everything now moves to the night of November 9, 1994, in Atascocita, Texas.
And this was all meticulously planned around the children's schedules to give Fratta an alibi.
The cold calculation is really evident in the logistics of that evening. First, Farah had dinner with Fratta and the children.
Okay.
Then, Fratta puts his alibi into motion. He takes the two younger kids to a church nursery and the oldest to a catechism class.
Creating a perfect window of time when he knew Farah would be home alone.
Exactly. But Farah actually left the house herself for a little while.
She went to get a haircut and then returned home completely unaware that a trap had been set.
And while she was doing that, Fratta was at the church establishing his alibi while the hitmen were moving into position.
The crime itself happened very quickly. She was in her own garage when she was attacked.
She was shot twice in the head by Howard Guidry.
And even though Fratta tried to make it look like a random act of violence, it wasn't completely unwitnessed, was it?
No. Neighbors heard the gunshots and saw Guidry rushing out of the garage to the getaway car. They described the gunman as an African-American man.
And Pristash was right there, driving the getaway car, fulfilling his role as the coordinator on the scene.
Mm-hmm.
The aftermath is interesting because the police immediately suspected Fratta, but they didn't have that smoking gun right away.
No. That lack of immediate physical evidence connecting him to the scene was a problem for them. They questioned him, of course.
But they had to release him.
They did. Insufficient evidence to directly link him to Pristash or Guidry, or to the weapon at that point.
But his behavior, that immediately raised red flags for everyone around him.
Witnesses noted he showed no sadness, no outrage, no concern at all about his wife's brutal murder.
That clinical detachment just screamed guilt, even if they couldn't prove it yet.
At the same time, Farah's family, the Bakers, they moved fast. Her parents, Betty and Lex Baker, offered a $5,000 reward for any clues.
That was the start of what would become nearly 3 decades of relentless fighting for justice.
It was. And the custody battle that started all of this was resolved almost immediately by the murder.
Right. In December 1994, just a month later, a family court judge granted full custody of the children to Farah's parents.
And the judge, Robert Hinojosa, was publicly very harsh with Fratta, calling him an unfit parent because of his connection to the murder.
So the very thing he killed her for, control of his children and his finances, he lost immediately.
Completely backfired on every level. He lost custody, and then he was fired from his job as a police officer. His whole plan just imploded.
But despite all that suspicion, the murder investigation itself, it stalled for months.
It did. And the sources are clear that the big break in the case didn't come from focusing on Fratta. It came from a completely unrelated crime.
It's fascinating how often that happens. The conspiracy was unraveled because the hitman got caught doing something else.
And that led police straight to the murder weapon.
The key date was March 1st, 1995. Howard Guidry was arrested for a bank robbery.
And during that arrest, police found a .38 caliber Charter Arms revolver in his backpack.
Just a stroke of pure investigative luck.
It was. And then, just a few days later, the case breaks wide open. Joseph Pristash's girlfriend, a woman named Mary Gipp, she contacted the police.
And she knew about the murder plot.
She did, and likely fearing she'd be implicated, she told them that Guidry was involved in Farah's killing.
Okay, so let's trace the path of that specific revolver, because this is the forensic key that ties the whole conspiracy together.
It is. Federal firearms records showed that Robert Fratta himself had purchased that exact gun back in 1982.
And Farah's father provided the critical piece of information. He confirmed that Farah had given him that same revolver to keep for her in 1993 because she was afraid of Fratta.
Right. And he also confirmed that he had returned the gun to Fratta in the summer of 1994, just months before the murder.
So that places the murder weapon directly in Fratta's possession right when he was planning all of this.
Then the ballistics evidence just cemented it. A firearms examiner from the Houston Police Department testified that a bullet fragment from the garage was definitively fired from that .38 caliber revolver found in Guidry's backpack.
And the second fragment?
It was damaged. So they couldn't get a perfect match, but they confirmed it was highly likely from the same manufacturer. The conclusion was undeniable.
The gun used by the triggerman, found during a bank robbery arrest, was a weapon purchased by and recently returned to Robert Fratta.
Exactly. With the weapon trace, the girlfriend's tip, and the ballistics match, they had enough. Fratta and Pristash were arrested.
And that's when the confessions started to come in from Pristash and Guidry, though those would become legally complicated later on.
Yes, but at the time, those statements, along with Mary Gipp's testimony, solidified the whole case. Fratta the mastermind, Pristash the coordinator, Guidry the executioner.
And even after all this, the original financial motive just kept popping up. The sources mention Fratta faced contempt charges for not paying child support.
It's a crucial detail. He was ordered to pay $3,000 or go to jail, even after the murder, which just reinforces that financial pressure he was under. He eventually paid, but it just shows his problems didn't go away.
So in 1996, the capital murder trials began. All three men, Fratta, Pristash, and Guidry, were tried separately.
And that was a very strategic decision by the prosecution. It allowed them to use the testimony of the co-conspirators against each other in their individual trials.
Let's start with Robert Fratta's trial in April 1996. The prosecution's case was built heavily on circumstantial evidence.
Absolutely. The ballistics were the anchor, but they also leaned heavily on all those witness statements from his friends and colleagues about his specific threats to kill Farah.
And they brought in a psychologist to testify.
Yes, a clinical psychologist, Lawrence Abrams, who testified that Fratta had a profound lack of empathy and saw women as objects to be dominated.
Which would fit the profile of a man who would orchestrate a murder when his control was threatened.
Precisely. And on April 18, 1996, the jury returned a guilty verdict for solicitation of murder.
The sentencing phase must have been incredibly emotional.
It was. Farah's mother, Betty Backer, gave a victim impact statement. She looked directly at her former son-in-law and called him a monster.
I can't even imagine that moment.
The jury was unanimous. On April 24, 1996, Robert Fratta was sentenced to death by lethal injection.
Next was Joseph Pristash, the middleman, in July 1996.
And the key witness against him was his own girlfriend, Mary Gipp, the one who first went to the police.
Her testimony must have been devastating for his case.
The jury thought so. They convicted him of capital murder after deliberating for only 17 minutes.
17 minutes.
And just a few days later, on July 11th, he was also sentenced to death.
So that leaves the gunman, Howard Guidry. His trial was in March of 1997.
He was only 18 when he committed the murder, but the prosecution argued his history of violence and the heinous nature of the crime warranted the death penalty.
The defense pushed for a life sentence.
They did. And the jury actually struggled with the decision. They were deadlocked for 2 days.
But they eventually came to a consensus.
Yes, on March 27, 1997, they recommended the death penalty for Guidry as well.
So within a year, all three men are convicted and sentenced to death. But that was really just the end of the first chapter.
It really was. What came next was nearly 3 decades of complex appeals and legal challenges that stretched this out for the Bakker family.
Right after the trials, from 98 to 2000, the appeals began. Fratta's initial ones were dismissed pretty quickly by the Texas courts and then the U.S. Supreme Court.
It looked like the convictions were solid at that point, but Guidry was having a very turbulent time on death row.
The sources mention a couple of major incidents. First, an attempted escape in 1998.
Yes, with 5 other inmates, it failed. And then, in February 2000, something even more serious.
The hostage situation.
A 13-hour hostage situation. He and another inmate held a female correctional officer protesting what they called poor living conditions. It ended peacefully, but it certainly didn't help his case for leniency.
No. But despite all that, the legal landscape did eventually shift. Both Guidry and Fratta managed to win new trials.
Let's start with Guidry's. In January 2005, a federal court granted him a retrial.
On what ground?
The court found that the original prosecution had misused hearsay evidence and had mishandled some other evidence. Basically, procedural errors.
So in 2007, 10 years later, he was back in court.
He was. And the prosecution had to rebuild their case, calling back the original witnesses, including Farah's father and Mary Gipp.
And the outcome?
The underlying facts were just too strong. Even without the procedural errors, the core evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of capital murder again.
And sentenced to death again.
And sentenced to death again on March 1st, 2007.
So then Fratta's case also gets overturned.
That's right. In October 2007, a U.S. district judge ruled that the case against Fratta had relied too heavily on the confessions of Pristash and Guidry.
citing questionable conduct by the police or prosecution in how they got those statements.
Exactly. So that set the stage for Fratta's second trial in 2009. And this one was a real test for the prosecution.
Because they were now barred from using the confessions of his accomplices against him?
Right. They had to prove his guilt using only the independent, circumstantial evidence.
And this is where the strength of the original investigation really shines through, isn't it?
It really is. The circumstantial case, the ballistics, his threats, the financial motive, it was so strong that it didn't even need the confessions. They presented the gun evidence, the witness testimony about his plans.
And then the most dramatic testimony of all came from his own children.
It's hard to fathom. They had changed their last names to Baker, their grandparents' name, effectively erasing him, to have them testify against their own father.
That has to be the most powerful indictment possible.
It really does. And on May 14, 2009, the jury found him guilty again of solicitation of capital murder.
And the sentencing phase, his defense argued for a life sentence, right?
They did, pointing to his good behavior in prison for 15 years. Yeah. But the prosecution argued that the crime was so calculated and cruel that he still deserved the ultimate penalty.
And the jury agreed. He was resentenced to death on May 29, 2009.
But even after the retrials, the appeals continued for another decade.
It wasn't until around 2018-2019 that the final appeals for Pristash and Fratta were exhausted by the Supreme Court.
Right. And with those appeals done, the focus finally shifted to the execution phase for Robert Fratta.
An execution order was signed in October 2022 for January 10, 2023.
And his defense team fought right up to the very end. They filed a lawsuit arguing that the state was using expired drugs for the lethal injection, which they claimed was cruel and unusual punishment.
That was rejected, and then there was another last-ditch appeal to the Supreme Court.
Yes, a very technical claim that prosecutors had hidden evidence that a witness had been hypnotized by investigators.
The Supreme Court dismissed that one as well, and his clemency petition was denied.
So the day of the execution arrived, January 10th, 2023, 28 years and 2 months after Farah's murder.
And there was still drama right up to the last minute. A judge actually issued a stay of execution over the expired drugs issue.
But that was immediately overturned by higher courts, and the execution went forward that night.
Robert Fratta was pronounced dead at 7:49 p.m.
And after all those years of proclaiming his innocence, the records show he made no final statement.
Just silence. The witnesses there included his own son, Bradley Backer, and Farah's brother, Zane Backer.
Andy Kahn, the director of victim services, called him a coward for not even acknowledging his family or offering an apology.
So Fratta was executed. What about the other two?
Joseph Pristash, the middleman, actually died on death row from unknown causes in June of 2025 before his execution date was set.
And Howard Guidry.
Howard Guidry, the gunman, remains on death row at the Allen B. Polunsky unit, still going through his own appellate process.
This case, it received a lot of media attention over the years. 48 Hours Mystery documentary series.
And most recently, a Hulu series called The Lesson is Murder featured interviews with Fratta from before his execution, where he maintained his innocence to the very end.
So we've walked through the whole timeline now, from the bitter divorce to the calculated murder-for-hire plot, all the way through decades of legal battles.
And what this material really shows is just how persistent the pursuit of justice has to be in a case like this. The determination of Farah's family, the Backers, for over 28 years is just incredible.
The whole case really hinged on that physical evidence. The revolver and the witness testimony about his motive, that ultimately proved to be more powerful than any confession.
And the retrials really highlight the scrutiny the justice system tries to apply, even when it leads back to the same result, which I think leaves a really interesting question for you to consider.
Okay, so what should you be thinking about here?
Well, the legal errors in Fratta's first trial were significant enough that he got a whole new trial. But he was convicted again, without the confessions, based solely on the strength of the other evidence, his motive, his threats, the gun. This suggests the truth of the case was so overwhelming that it couldn't be undone by procedural mistakes. So the question is, does a focus on perfecting legal procedure always align with the ultimate pursuit of justice?
Thank you for joining us for this in-depth look at the source material. We hope this exploration provided you with valuable perspective on the facts of this tragic case. Host, speaker, and expert speaker, thanks for listening.